The Gazans, you fall in love with Palestinians, you fall in love with the Gazans, and I can't tell you why, you just do. That's something that comes across with whoever visits Gaza.
One woman was saying how she had her 6 kids in the tent. She went to cook them something to eat, and she came back and she found them ash, and she was able to carry all 6 of her children in one hand.
Mitchell's final comment on that occasion was when someone had mentioned the word genocide. He looked up, having been spent most of the meeting texting on his phone, he looked up and said any suggestion of a genocide is both obnoxious and hideous, and then got his papers together with a view to going out. Then Cameron got out and said, oh, and by the way, I'm very sorry you were bombed.
But then it gets more pernicious than that. At the moment in my law firm, we're dealing with and protecting individuals that are defending themselves from the police, from criminal allegations, from the Charity Commission, from regulatory allegations, from the the Solicitors Regulatory Authority, from allegations there, and from the GMC and the NHS. This is not something that's happening by accident. It's systematic, it's purposeful, it's organised.
And so, this is how the humanitarian sector and the aid sector is complicit, essentially, in the apartheid regime.
So I'm going to introduce our panel in a few moments. It's a great honor to have this panel. They're a very special panel with real on-the-ground experience of fighting for this cause. But it's important that this audience understands that this is not about us up on this stage. This is about you. You have the power. The first rule of Fight Club here is that you have the power. This is about you. The second rule of Fight Club is that there's not going to be any easy questions tonight. The Palestinian people are not dealing with easy questions. The people in Gaza are not dealing with easy questions. And certainly, Rafah is not a place for easy questions now. And we'd be doing a great disservice to them if we felt comfortable after this event tonight. We've got an amazing panel who are more than capable of taking the tough questions. We're going to throw some tough questions at them, and we'd like the audience to do the same. And the last thing before I actually go ahead and introduce our panel is just to say this is a very special venue. This church, this sacred space, is where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his first British sermon. And what we need to understand is that we're standing on the shoulders of giants who have shown us that this can be done. This is not some remote possibility. This is an inevitability, but it's only inevitable if we make it inevitable. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panel. Shall I start with Professor Tahsin Qureshi, if you can please take your seat. So Professor Tahsin Qureshi is an expert in robotic surgery. He's an internationally renowned expert in laparoscopic surgery. He's been involved for several years since 2019 in trying to set up a tertiary center for cancer services in Gaza and in Palestine. And he was recently working in Nasser Hospital during the conflict in Gaza. We can, thank you. If we can have after that Professor Nick Maynard. Professor Nick Maynard is another professor of surgery, extremely eminent. He was the head of cancer services at Oxford University Hospital's NHS Trust for many years. He was the president of the Association of Upper GI Surgery of Great Britain and Ireland. He has also been involved for many years in medical education. He has also served in Gaza during this conflict. If we could next have Tayyab Ali. So I'm really pleased to have Tayyab Ali here today. He is an eminent lawyer. He is the director of the International Center for Justice for Palestinians. He is the head of international law at one of the biggest law firms in the UK, Binmans. And he has the distinguished sort of history of having managed to get an arrest warrant for an Israeli minister in 2009 in the British courts. So please thank him. And last but not least, if we can have Amira Nimarawi. So Amira Nimarawi started off working as a nurse, then went into healthcare finance, then got a master's in public health, then got an MBA, and now she's playing a key role in Mustafa Margouti's organization, the Palestinian Relief Medical Association, working with multiple NGOs, trying to get aid to people in Gaza and to Palestinian people who have managed to take refuge in Egypt. She is also the chief executive officer of probably the most dynamic healthcare activist organization I've come across, and I've come across a few, and that's Health Workers for Palestine. So please give her a round of applause. I'm going to start with some easy questions. I won't go straight into the tough questions. So Nick, when I interviewed you in March, when I first interviewed you, we were talking about the prospect of an invasion of Rafah. And at that time, I remember you told me that an invasion would be apocalyptic. And you've just quite recently returned from Gaza on the 6th of May, just on the eve of the actual invasion, just as it was getting underway. Can you describe what your last mission to Gaza was like, what you saw while you were there, and what happened as you left Rafah?
Yeah, this was my second mission since October the 7th, and it was different to the first one. The first mission over Christmas and New Year, we saw a huge amount of trauma, severe blast injuries, burn injuries. We saw slightly less of that on this occasion, but we saw, and with my colleague Yasser, who was one of the surgeons out there with me in the audience, we saw some awful cases as a result of malnutrition. So these are all patients who'd had serious blast or gunshot injuries a few days, a few weeks before, who had already had surgery, some by other people, some by us, but they'd developed terrible complications because of malnutrition. And that was a really strong narrative from our most recent trip, and how devastating the impact of malnutrition is. And it's not just about people losing weight. This is about major injuries not healing, tissues not healing, intestinal repairs leaking. So these poor people having their bowel contents leaking out of their wounds. And Yasser and I saw some appalling cases, including two young females, Tala, who was 16, and Lama, who was 18, both of whom had survivable injuries, both of whom had multiple operations, and both of whom died when we were there as a direct result of the complications of malnutrition. So that was the really strong narrative. And on our final day, as we left through Rafah, that was the day, May the 6th, where there'd been issued the first orders to evacuate. And of course, the bombing started that day before they had evacuated. And as we left through Rafah, we saw many, many Rafah inhabitants beginning to evacuate, leaving their shelters, leaving their tents, leaving the homes to which they'd already been displaced many occasions. And of course, as we got to the crossing, we were surrounded by bombs going off. And that was really we got out at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We were the last people to get out before the Israeli Defense Force invaded the crossing. And it's been closed ever since.
Okay, so that's obviously a painful story to tell. My next question is for Tarsi. So you went to Gaza with a medical aid organization in January, and I understand your guest house, a guest house for medical aid workers, was actually bombed by the Israeli Air Force. Can you talk us through what happened, why you think the guest house was targeted, and what you think of the response of the British government?
That was the easy question, wasn't it? So, look, just some pretext. The safe house was chosen as a safe house because in days gone by, it was a guest house. So it's way away from other houses. So nobody could then say, well, we were aiming for that, I'm sorry we got you. And it's also built on sand, so you can't build tunnels in sand. So it was chosen as a safe house for that reason. What was it like being bombed? Well, you can understand that it's etched in my mind. It's very clear as though it happened yesterday. So the narrative won't change over time. We had just laid down after the morning prayer, what we call the Fajr prayer. So it was dark. And I was talking to my counterpart. There was two of us in each room. And we were just talking about banal stuff. And then the only way I can describe it is that there was a blinding flash of light. In fact, before that, you'd hear aeroplanes all the time, but that's not unusual. But the difference this time was that I heard a whine, like the bzzz, just like that. And then there was a blinding flash of light. And it was as though the house was lifted up off its foundations and just dropped down again. So as soon as that happened, we were worried about not ourselves. We were worried because we'd taken the conscious decision to put ourselves in that situation. But the guest houses were babysat by families, Gazan families, and there was a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old with us. So there was a guy called Sajid and his sister. So our first thought was for them, and they were fine. But then we knew that when jets passed, there's 2 wings to the jet, and usually there was double ordnance fired. So we were waiting for the next one. And then as time elapsed, we then realized that actually it was just going to be one. Words are difficult, pictures are much better, but it was the whole ceiling fell down, all the windows came down. We had like patio doors in our bedroom, the doors came off their hinges. We were pretty much thrown onto the floor. So that was the experience. Etched in my mind. How do I feel about it? To be honest with you, this is what I now understand what the Palestinians go through every single day. And I give this sort of talk in advocacy, and I make a very strong point that this isn't about me, and don't make it about me. This is just, wow, this is what they go through. And honestly, as soon as that happened to us, we wanted to go back to the hospital, but all the NGOs understandably were told no. And the thing that was really heartbreaking was the Gazans, you fall in love with Palestinians, you fall in love with the Gazans, and I can't tell you why, you just do. That's something that comes across with whoever visits Gaza. But they didn't understand why we would put ourselves in that position in the first place. But when this happened, they felt awful. So they literally, it was like they picked us up on a pedestal and wouldn't let our feet touch the ground, metaphorically speaking. And they protected us as best they could for the 2 days until we got the deconfliction permission to go back out through Rafah. And then as you turn around, I live a life of privilege. I can come out whenever I want. And you turn around, and the people that you want to say thank you to are turning their cars around and going back into that. So that's what it felt like.
And sorry to go back to the difficult part of the question, the British government. What were your feelings? I mean, I remember in the news, I heard a lot from Alicia Kearns. She's not really part of the British government. She's the Foreign Affairs Select Committee chair, right? Yeah. But you'd expect your government to back you up, right?
So what would I do if I was in the British government? There were 4 British nationals and an American national. If it was on my watch and 4 of my nationals had been affected in this way, I'd at the very least reach out to them. I'd at the very least invite them, even if it was just a PR opportunity. At least reach out and give an opportunity to say what you need to say and show some empathy. That's what I would have done.
Okay, so we don't need any further comment than that, I think. Amira, can we ask you the next question? This is probably the most difficult and most painful question. You are Palestinian. We've all heard the dreadful news from Rafah last night. Have you, by the nature of your job, have you heard any first-hand reports of what happened?
Yes, I have. So actually, the first messages and contact that I received was from a British doctor who is currently in Rafah and has chosen to stay. And he consistently messages me since he's gone in And usually, I was just saying to Dr. Nick, usually his messages are pictures of watermelon stands or the beach and just life in Gaza and how people have continued somehow to create a sense of life. But last night, his messages during the attacks or just after the attacks were, oh God, it's a massacre, more than 70 people injured at his trauma point, and more than 15 arriving dead. And so for him to message me during that sort of activity really says a lot to me, because I sense that usually his messages to me to sort of instill hope in me that, you know, somehow people are still living and that there is still hope. So to get that from him, and then this morning from our PMRS teams that are on the ground, just, I mean, you've probably seen the images and there's no words really to explain, but, you know, one woman was saying how she had her 6 kids in the tent. She went to cook them something to eat, and she came back and she found them ash, and she was able to carry all 6 of her children in one hand, and she just couldn't let go of them, and she was still kissing and hugging them. And so for our medical staff on the ground as well, you know, they've been witnessing and they continue to witness types of injuries that they'd never seen before. We can't say that they're using illegal weapons at this point, but, you know, the point is that they've never seen injuries like this before. And, you know, it's just continuing.
Thank you, Amira. Not sure really how to follow that up. Tayyib, can we ask you 2 questions for you?
Sure.
You've just heard accounts from 3 healthcare leaders, really. They're credible people, highly credible people, much more credible than our political leaders. In a nutshell, what are the legal implications of these stories?
So before I answer that question, I just want to make a comment, if that's all right. People ask me often about the work that I do and my colleagues at the ICJP, whether we fear for our lives because of the way that Israel operates and Israel's allies operate. And I think just listening to my colleagues in the panel today, I have a new answer for people. These guys put themselves in the firing line to save life. And they have no fear in doing that, or at least it's not apparent. And I think I'd just like you all just to acknowledge that for a moment and just to think how brave you must be to take a flight into a war zone where people are trying to flee and then go there with nothing more than medical equipment to put people literally back together. So can we just take a moment and just thank you. The first doctor I met was Dr. Professor Ghassan Abu Sitta, who had returned from Gaza. And this is answering a question now. I thought he was unique, actually, in what he is unique in many ways, but I thought he was unique. I thought there couldn't be more than one person able to do what he did. I've now met over 20 people that have given eyewitness testimony about what they've seen on the ground in Gaza. And I suppose to answer your question, I can't just rely at the moment on the shorter account that we've heard now, but looking at the evidence that we've collected, given to Scotland Yard and given to the International Criminal Court, that evidence taken together provided me with a basis for a series of criminal offences and international humanitarian law breaches. And just to put it into a nutshell, because I'm sure you don't want a legal lecture, but just to summarize it, the evidence that I've collected constitutes very clear breaches of international law, including attacking civilian objects, including medical infrastructure. And also, really importantly, you may have noted last week, the ICJP launched a criminal complaint to Scotland Yard just after the ICC, Karim Khan, made an announcement that he was applying for arrest warrants. One of the allegations that he found was starvation. So we last week also issued a complaint about, in respect of at least 5 British ministers for their part in the war crime of starvation. Now, starvation is not just in the terms of stopping people from eating, but also taking away the mechanisms they require to sustain life. And we've seen that across the board. My view of the evidence that I've seen so far is that it's very clear. Israel, and I can say this in this way, Israel is targeting the medical infrastructure. Israel is targeting the civilian infrastructure generally. Israel is targeting civilians as a whole, and specifically targeting those people that could prevent the loss of life and devastation, including not just the medical infrastructure, but for example, the police infrastructure, the legal infrastructure, almost any infrastructure you could think of. That in totality forms the crime of collective punishment, but also is a significant element to the way forward to the crime of genocide. We haven't yet compiled a complaint of genocide, and that's simply because we are still collating evidence to be able to support that as an allegation. But we have clear evidence that Israel has breached, I would say, almost every element of the Geneva Convention, the Rome Statute. And that makes my job difficult, but also very easy.
Thank you, Tayyab. And just moving really to a completely different aspect of what you do. So obviously, doctors and Amira here are very brave and very courageous, and we have so many examples of doctors such as that. But there's also seems to be a process, almost a sort of chilling effect on the medical profession as a whole. We know that several very senior healthcare leaders, we're talking about people at the level of the president of a Royal College, the very top level of the British Medical Association, have been accused of anti-Semitism for speaking up for Palestine. What do you think is going on here? I mean, is the regulator, the medical regulator, being weaponized against doctors? And why specifically do you think doctors are being targeted? And how can we collectively speak up for Palestinians in this environment?
I mean, it's yes. I mean, the answer is yes. Our institutions are being weaponized against Palestinian advocacy. There are organizations like the UK LFI, United Kingdom Lawyers for Israel, that does exactly what it says in the tin, which is not look to regulate our medical profession and safeguard the public from potential misconduct by medical professionals. No, it doesn't do that. What it does is purely and simply act to protect Israel. And if it can do that, and I'm naming names, I'm telling you who I'm talking about. There's nothing sort of secret about this as far as I'm concerned. I'm prepared to point fingers where fingers duly should be pointed. Where what they are doing is they're trying to silence the voice of Palestinian advocacy across the board. So if there is a doctor that is speaking about Palestine, you will find that there will be either at the lower levels on the internet, on Twitter, on the social media, constant attacks or constant rubbishing of what they're saying, to the degree of also blatant lying. So factual misrepresentations about what they've said, or even factual misrepresentation about what's actually going on the ground in Gaza. But then it gets more pernicious than that. At the moment in my law firm, we're dealing with and protecting individuals that are defending themselves from the police, from criminal allegations, from the Charity Commission, from regulatory allegations, from the Law Society, the Solicitors Regulatory Authority, from allegations there, and from the GMC and the NHS. This is not something that's happening by accident. It's systematic, it's purposeful, it's organized, and unfortunately, these institutions, I feel, are allowing themselves to be used in that way, perhaps not by accident, perhaps purposefully, because they take their lead from the government. And the government, in my view, is complicit in war crimes in Israel and Gaza.
That was very categoric. Thank you for that, Tayyab. So
Nick, the answers might be tougher than your questions, maybe.
So next question is for Nick. Nick, this is really going to be a tough one. I'm really sorry. I have to apologize in advance. So when I first interviewed you on the 24th of March, your genuine love and passion and admiration for the Palestinian people really shone through. But at that time, you had met David Cameron to talk about the war crimes you'd witnessed. You'd gone to the United States, you'd spoken at the United Nations, you'd gone to the White House and spoken to at least one very senior administration official there. And your feeling was that they had understood the gravity of the situation. Knowing what you do now, knowing what's happening in Rafah, and knowing what the British government and the United States response to that is, do you think that you were invited to these meetings genuinely so that these people could learn from your experience? Or do you think that you were being co-opted? And I'm going to read out a definition from the Harvard Business Review of co-optation. Co-opting a group involves giving one of its leaders or someone it respects a key role in the design or implementation of a change. This is not a form of participation, however, because the initiators do not want the advice of the co-opted, merely his or her endorsement. Go ahead.
Yeah, that was a tough one, isn't it? Thank you, Musa. I would separate, I've thought a lot about it, and I know the conversations you and I had that perhaps you wanted me to say a little bit more in our previous interviews, and I understand that. And I suspect I'm probably prepared to do so now. I would separate the USA trip to the UK trip for the following reasons. I think we did meet, and I think we genuinely were listened to in the US, both the UN and in DC. The only senior member of the administration we met, I've heard her speak on many occasions since, and I am quite clear that she is trying to fight a lone battle against Biden out there. The other people we met were sort of one tier down, and I think they not only listened, I think they were genuinely trying to change things, but they have been thwarted completely by their president. The situation in the UK was different, and perhaps I was guilty of being naive, I don't know. I'm certainly not a politician. I was at the time reasonably happy that there was a serious attempt to listen to us, but I think that was probably rather naive of us. I say us because it wasn't just me. I think it was a tick box exercise meeting Cameron and Mitchell. I think that when I go over the meetings we had, I think I told you I was pretty appalled by the way that Mitchell had behaved, but Cameron, we felt, had listened to us. And I think there was a period of time following that when his public statements were a lot better than they had, certainly his predecessor had been, but I think he's fallen well short of that level recently. And I think I think it was a tick box exercise. I don't think he was particularly interested in hearing what we had to say. And it was, if I tell you what his comment at the end of it was, which I don't think I told you at the time, and it's in relation to what Taz has just told us about the accommodation being blown up, and I'd been living in that house just a week before Taz, so can really feel the visceral description he gives of that. As Mitchell's final comment on that occasion was when someone had mentioned the word genocide, he looked up, having been spent most of the meeting texting on his phone, he looked up and said any suggestion of a genocide is both obnoxious and hideous, and then got his papers together with a view to going out. Then Cameron got out and said, "Oh, and by the way, I'm very sorry you were bombed." Those were his final words. So, listen, I have changed my view a little bit since then, and I think they were not really wanting to listen, and they had no choice but to hear what we said. And indeed, I showed him laminated and large pictures of burnt children that we had treated, dead children with amputated limbs. So there was no question he was given the information with which he could have acted, but it was ignored.
Okay, thank you for taking that difficult question. The next question is for Amira. Amira, if we can just hand you the microphone. So, got an interesting one for you, hopefully very educational for all of us. You're a social impact specialist working with the Palestine Medical Relief Society. You've got a master's in public health, an MBA, so you know how money works. And my understanding is with PMRS, you basically work with multiple NGOs to help Palestinians access medical care in Gaza, the West Bank, Egypt. Can you tell us how that process is controlled? I mean, how does money move in the NGO industry? Who controls the bank accounts? How was Gaza's healthcare system funded when it existed?
Okay, so first of all, the Palestinian Medical Relief Society is the largest Palestinian-led and run medical organization on the ground. And we don't work with other NGOs, we lead the work. And we have teams right across Palestine, which is really unique. So we have our teams on the ground in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, which is really important because that's where there's a massive gap. So technically, Palestinians living in East Jerusalem should fall under the Israeli health system, but we know that they don't fulfill their obligations under international law to provide that care. And medical teams from the Ministry of Health in the West Bank are not allowed to enter that space. So PMRS is actually working in that space, and that's really important. And I just want to add that we're not actually allowed to call ourselves Palestinian Medical Relief Society there. We're only allowed to call ourselves Medical Relief Society. So even just from that perspective, we start to understand the medical apartheid that exists. We also have teams in Gaza. Currently, we have 41 medical teams on the ground in Gaza. So to your point around the money, essentially any money that's coming in to Palestine that is foreign aid, let's say, and most of the money, if not all of the money, is actually controlled by Israel. So it has to go through Israel before it comes to us. Even Palestinian bank accounts are only allowed to hold a certain amount of money, and they have to go through all of the checks and the balances, and it's controlled by Israel, essentially.
And can you tell us a bit more about, for instance, the European Union? They donate a lot of money to Palestine. What conditions are imposed on the Palestinian people when these donations are made?
So the EU is quite interesting because as a collective, they're the largest donor for foreign aid, specifically for humanitarian projects and some development projects. Unfortunately, in the last years, the emphasis has been on humanitarian sector, and hopefully we get to that later, but rather than development. And I have issues with this, and just highlight it now, because the humanitarian sector is just a band-aid. It's meant to be a short-term thing. What we should be doing, what PMRS strives to do, as Omar pointed out, Dr. Barghouti has spent his career essentially strengthening the healthcare system, and that's what we try to do. But it's not just the EU, but as an example, the EU places strict stipulations in terms of how we can use that money. And one of the sort of most, heinous, aspects of this is the fact that any organization that is receiving funding from the EU is not allowed to provide any of their services to any of the ex-detainees at all. And so as a healthcare organization, we're not allowed technically to be providing medical care to anyone that has been detained. And we know that these are our hostages, right? And it's not just since the 7th of October that we now have 4,000 people that are essentially held hostage, including a dear friend of mine. Over the years, we've had children, a lot of minors, increasingly over the last 10 years in particular. And so, this is how the humanitarian sector and the aid sector is complicit, essentially, in the apartheid regime.
Yeah, that's really appalling, especially when we know that many children are detained without any sort of legal process. Hundreds, thousands of children have been detained under those conditions. So apparently the European Union money cannot go towards treating those children. Is that correct? Okay. That to me seems to go against some very basic medical ethical values. I treat prisoners all the time in the United Kingdom. They come to the hospital, they'll come with a police guard, but there's nobody, according to the European Union Charter, who should be deprived of the right to healthcare. But when it comes to Palestinians, even children who are being detained without any legal process whatsoever are denied care. Tayeb, next question for you.
Why are you laughing?
I'm laughing because I'm about to talk about what I think about international legal processes. So you might not know this. I actually did a law degree, and then I decided I wanted to become a doctor because I wanted.
Good decision. Good decision.
I just got turned off by what I saw lawyers doing. You're a very different breed of lawyer, I have to say. But I want to talk about the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. They've recently ruled that Israel must immediately, I'm reading this out actually, the quote, Israel must immediately halt its military offensive and any other action in the Rafah governorate. And this is the bit that's a bit controversial. They've said after that, which may inflict on the Palestinian group in Gaza conditions of life that could bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Now, that organization of lawyers that you mentioned earlier, I've actually looked on their website, and their interpretation is that Israel's actions can't bring about the destruction of the Palestinian group, and therefore the whole ICJ order doesn't apply to them. And the ICJ hasn't ordered them to stop its invasion of Rafah. It's only ordered them to stop its invasion of Rafah if they're going to destroy the Palestinian group, which they're saying they're not going to do. So I guess my question is, what is the point of the legal wranglings in front of the ICJ? And is any of this actually going to stop Israel's war crimes?
That quote that you read out, read the last words, the last bits of the quote. What does it say?
Which may inflict on the Palestinian group in Gaza conditions of life that could bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part.
In whole or in part. In part. Full stop. So it doesn't matter what UKLFI say. By the way, the last order that the ICJ made, and the one before that, UKLFI considered it not to be, by the UKLFI rubbish, right? Just frankly, right? They're not. They're probably the kind of lawyers that put you off, frankly, right? The dark side, right? Anyway, so what they originally were arguing at UKLFI, which was taken up by really senior lawyers, including people with Lord at the beginning of the name and Casey at the end of it, for what that's worth, anymore. And so what they were saying was that there wasn't even an order that recognized plausible genocide in Gaza. And when the former president of the ICJ gave her inappropriate, in my view, interview to describe what that meant, she decided that she could unilaterally interpret the judgment of 17 judges by herself and give voice to that, which is also inappropriate during proceedings. And what UKLFI forgot or purposefully missed out was the second part of the order in terms of risk of genocide, which is the reason why that was relevant was because of the provisional order requirement of irreparable harm. So if you only make an order to stop somebody doing something, if that order is going to prevent irreparable harm, you only ask people to stop doing something which is going to cause irreparable harm if there's a risk of something, right? Risk of genocide. So UKLFI, I'm really proud to say, blocked me on Twitter because I made that argument really strongly. It's like, you know, a good place to be on social media if you're getting blocked by UKLFI. But on a serious point, this is what they do. And this is why you're all so important, because there are people like me who can interpret the law appropriately and explain it appropriately. And I've just done that by asking you to read the last bit. So it doesn't really matter, without going into detail, the argument about this is that order was badly drafted because there were commas put between and other places and a comma afterwards, right? But it doesn't matter. Read the whole thing as a whole. It's very clear what the court was trying to do. They were ordering an immediate halt to Israeli action in Rafah because if Israel didn't do that in whole or in part, there was a risk of genocide. Israel hasn't done that. Israel is in breach of the order. Okay, can I just expand on this a little bit? Mm-hmm. Because I also, one of the reasons I became a lawyer was the exact same reason you didn't become a lawyer, because I saw how law was abused by people, how international institutions were failing. World War II is really important to me. When I was learning about World War II, there were a couple of numbers that were really important to me. They really left an impact on me. One was 6 million because of the impact of the Holocaust. But the other number that was really, I remember learning about as an infant school child, I think I remember, learning about World War II, but later on learning about a different number. That number was 75 million people, right? 75 million people died in World War II. That is a phenomenal catastrophe that human beings have caused on themselves. It's unbelievable. And then what we did, and I'll keep this short because I know there's lots of other people that have lots of really important things to say. What we did after that is we decided to create an infrastructure, a framework, a law-based order, not a rules-based order, a law-based order. We created the United Nations and the Security Council and the General Assembly, and we created the ICJ and the ICC decades later. These are really important because what they were designed to do as a whole was to stop not just 6 million people dying, and I don't mean to belittle that because that had a massive impact on me, but to stop us killing 75 million of ourselves again. I mean, that's an amazing thing we tried to prevent happening because we know ourselves, we know what human beings do if they're left unchecked. We needed rules, we needed law to prevent that from happening. We needed to check power at the top. And you can see what's happening right now. There is a separation between our leaders, the kinds of people that you met when you're in the British government, and the rest of us, because we know what's happening, don't we? We see what's happening. We have it beamed on our telephones. We don't need these institutions to tell us what's happening. We know it, we see it. The problem now is that the institutions are not living up to their mandates. The Security Council is a failure. The General Assembly is a failure. The ICJ is a failure. The ICC is nearly a failure, not quite yet. We'll see.
Can I stop you there? Because my next question is about the ICC, actually. It's not often we get a lawyer of your stature at these meetings, so I really want to take full advantage of this. The ICC, in many ways, could potentially be much more effective than the ICJ. And the reason, my understanding is, the reason is because all the signatory states of the Rome Statute have an obligation. And in fact, the United Kingdom has actually enacted the Rome Statute into British legislation. What that means is that if somebody has an arrest warrant and they come to the United Kingdom, the British police have to arrest that person. There's a real mechanism for enforcing that arrest warrant. So potentially it's really powerful what's happening with the ICC recently. My question is, why do you think the ICC has started the clock on October the 7th? Okay,
first of all, the ICC, it's not the ICC, and this is relatively controversial for somebody who's a Palestinian advocate. The ICC's job is not to stop war crimes. The ICC's job is to hold war criminals accountable after the event. You don't arrest a murderer before he's murdered somebody. You arrest them afterwards and you prosecute and punish them. The job of preventative justice is the job of the ICJ. That's why South Africa initiated proceedings under the Genocide Convention, and the massively failing and dysfunctional Security Council, who are meant to, people say all the time, the ICJ doesn't have an enforcement mechanism. It does. It has the strongest enforcement mechanism in human history. It's got the Security Council. The Security Council is composed of states with huge armies, including the United States. It's not working in the appropriate way. Coming back to the ICC, and your question, you're correct. The reason the ICC is really important is because once it's issued the warrants, it triggers obligations in 124 states across the globe to arrest, investigate, and prosecute, even potentially domestically, or hand over the suspected war criminal to the ICC. But you know what? We don't need the ICC to see what the problem is, because as you said, in 2009, I got an arrest warrant for Zippy Livni based on real, concrete, solid evidence given to a senior judge in the chief magistrate in a magistrate's court, whose job it was to determine whether that evidence should lead to an arrest warrant. He decided it should on a prima facie basis. That means on a basis that could be prosecuted without further investigation. My case was solid. When Zippy Livni came to this country, it wasn't the police that failed, or the arrest warrant that failed, or me as a lawyer that failed, although I do feel a little bit like a failure because of that. It was the politicians that created a shield of impunity to protect her. And the mistake I made, the mistake we made, lawyers like me that were working, which we are determined not to make this time, is that when politicians in the United Kingdom protected Zippy Livni as a suspected war criminal and let her walk up and down the streets of Britain and meet with politicians and then leave the country completely without arrest, investigation, prosecution, we left it at that because we always attacked the political actors in the theatre of warfare, i.e. the IDF soldiers on the ground, Zippy Livni as a command control politician above her. But this time, when we issued notices as part of the ICJP, shortly after the second week of the attack on Gaza, we issued notices to British politicians because we'd learned from our mistakes. We're no longer prepared for there to be a shield of impunity created by our politicians. Article 24 Article 25 of the Rome Statute is the article that talks about complicity, aiding and abetting, or in any other way supporting the commission of a war crime. So if a British politician, the Attorney General, a police officer, the director of the Crown Prosecution Service decides this time, and you know that we've already issued complaints about British politicians in the United Kingdom under the International Criminal Court Act for prosecution and investigation and prosecution by the British police. But this time, if they do the same thing again, this time we'll be referring them to the ICC for prosecution because as far as I'm concerned, that protection is aiding and abetting a war criminal. And we're not prepared to let that happen this time.